Welcome to Lesson 5, where we'll be discussing the anabolic window. And even though this concept has been largely debunked within the context of muscle growth, it's still an important point in the evolution of our knowledge of how to program things to optimize muscle growth with nutrient timing and protein distribution. So let's go ahead and take a look at the origins of the anabolic window. Back in 2004, John Ivey and Robert Portman, both of them are academic researchers, they wrote a paperback called Nutrient Timing, and it was a hit back in that time, 20-ish years ago. And the cover art indicates that it was geared towards the fitness and bodybuilding audience. And they were the first to present the concept of the post-exercise anabolic window to the masses. And so the anabolic window theory or anabolic window hypothesis goes something like this. After you resistance train, you have about 30 to 60 minutes to consume a combination of quickly absorbed protein and carbohydrate in order to stimulate an insulin response and spike muscle protein synthesis and expedite recovery and therefore maximize muscle growth. So that was the anabolic window theory, or it was also called the post-exercise anabolic window of opportunity. So it's important to realize that this was rooted in research that examined glycogen resynthesis rates when you either consumed carbohydrate immediately after glycogen depleting exercise, or whether this ingestion of carbohydrate was delayed. So the delayed ingestion of carbs post glycogen depleting exercise resulted, rather unsurprisingly, in less glycogen resynthesis after a few hours post exercise. So what we can say is that there is a window of opportunity for consuming carbohydrate if you need to maximize glycogen resynthesis rates, if indeed you need to be fully restocked with muscle glycogen stores to be able to compete in endurance exercise or in an endurance event within short order, within a short time frame, within the same day. So there is that. But this concept kind of got superimposed with the goal of muscle growth until the march of research spawned further acute studies examining the muscle protein synthesis response of post-exercise protein and or carbohydrate that was co-ingested. And it was found that when amino acids or protein combined with carbohydrate was ingested post-exercise, then this stimulated muscle protein synthesis to a greater degree than carbohydrate by itself or protein by itself. And so this co-ingestion concept was born. Now, I'm going to kind of spoil the fun and say that further research down the line showed that once the protein dose was about 20 grams or more, then carbohydrate co-ingested with that protein did not further elevate muscle protein synthesis. So it's important to note the limitations of this short-term research that comprised the foundation for the anabolic window concept. So indeed, when protein and carbohydrate were consumed immediately post-exercise versus a significant delay post-exercise, then the muscle protein synthesis response was blunted in the delayed conditions. And the same thing was true with immediate versus delayed ingestion of carbohydrate on glycogen resynthesis. But we have to realize that this research was done in overnight fasted individuals, and it is very rare that anybody whose main goal is to gain muscle mass resistance trains in fasted conditions. And while this post-exercise anabolic window theory is questionable, it still gave us a lot of food for thought, and it kind of set the stage for further investigation. So we'll take a look at that. So fast forward from 2004 to 2013, where this was actually my first peer-reviewed publication. It was a narrative review that I co-authored with Brad Schoenfeld, who I credit for getting my foot in the door of the research world. And in our narrative review, we discussed the limitations of the short-term studies, which I just did. And we also discussed how the body of studies to date, looking at anabolic window, post-exercise timed protein and or carbohydrate conditions in those conditions versus just non-timed conditions, which I'll discuss further, really didn't show a consistent advantage. So in other words, consuming protein and or carbohydrates in the post-exercise anabolic window did not seem to show a consistent advantage in resistance trainees in studies that were carried out beyond the short term. And so we questioned the post-exercise anabolic window concept. And we questioned it largely on the basis of, well, total daily nutrition must matter a lot. And secondly, if you consume a pre-exercise meal, which was a mixed macronutrient meal, which is typical, then that pre-exercise meal is potentially going to dictate the post-exercise environment if that meal was consumed close enough pre-exercise. And so there was a lot of questions hanging. And so what we did after we upset a lot of the folks who really believed in the post-exercise anabolic window concept, we conducted a meta-analysis of the studies to date that specifically examined the anabolic window concept. And we only included longitudinal studies. And so what these studies did, and our conditions were set at comparing studies that either timed protein immediately pre or post exercise. In other words, that timed protein within an hour of pre or post exercise. So those were the timed conditions. And then the non-timed conditions, we looked at studies that imposed a period of nutrient neglect for a minimum of 2 hours on both sides of the training bout. And what we found was, as long as total daily protein equaled about 1.6, 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, then the timing of protein didn't show any significant effect or significant advantage on gains in muscle size and strength. So after we did that meta-analysis, a few years afterwards, 2017, we did a study that directly investigated the post-exercise anabolic window concept. And so we figured that if indeed there is a post-exercise anabolic window of opportunity to feed and expedite muscle growth, then maybe it could be achieved by an immediate pre-exercise protein dose. And this is because of the time course of appearance of nutrients in the blood after you consume a meal. It's not immediate. So if you consume a bolus of protein, it's going to be a certain amount of lag time before amino acids are circulating in the blood at maximal elevations. So we figured that, hey, we might actually be able to nail this post-exercise anabolic window with a pre-exercise protein dose. So let's compare that to an immediate post-exercise protein dose and see if there is a difference. And indeed, we did that. And indeed, there overall was no significant advantage to the immediate pre-exercise protein dosing compared to the immediate post-exercise protein dosing. And we had to conclude ultimately that overall, the so-called anabolic window in the post-exercise period, it just did not have this mystical advantage. And it reinforced the concept that we had when we wrote our narrative review a few years prior to this. And the concept was that most resistance trainees who are seeking to maximize muscle growth as their main goal, they don't train in a fasted state. And so it makes no sense to imagine that there is this immediate post-exercise anabolic window to consume protein and or carbohydrate when you still have your pre-exercise protein and carbohydrate seeping into circulation during and sometimes even after the training bout. So here is the latest anabolic window study done by Yassine Lak, and this was just this year that it was published. And they took our meta-analysis as a jump-off point from which to design their study. So they used resistance-trained subjects. And their comparison was protein timed within an hour of both sides of the training bout. So that was one condition. And then the other group consumed protein outside of 3 hours on both sides. So a 3-hour period of protein neglect on both sides of the training bout. So they were way out of the anabolic window, way far off from the anabolic window. Okay, so interestingly, there are no significant differences between groups in muscle size and strength gain. But both groups consumed an optimal amount of protein, right around 2-ish grams per kilogram of body weight. And so this is a very big nail in the post-exercise anabolic window concept, courtesy of Yassine Lak and colleagues. And it just comes to show that the specific positioning of protein relative to the training bout in the context of multiple meals in the course of a day, it just doesn't make enough difference to be important and to obsess over. So we'll talk about the concept called the peri-exercise time frame, which, even though that post-exercise anabolic window stuff ended up being well debunked, it still gave rise to a different concept that potentially has greater utility in the pursuit of maximal gains in muscle. And we will get to that in lesson 6.